Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm joined again by Nexus. Now, it's been a while. I think I had you on a year or two ago.
Yeah,
I don't even remember what we talked about, but
a little
at
bit of everything back then.
a little bit of everything, I think so. But at this point, you had mentioned in some private discussions we were having that you had seen how dysfunctional marriage and relationships are, and you have some of your own ideas of how that can be addressed. So why don't we first sort of discuss what you see are the problems and the pathologies in this area?
Todd, I hate to interrupt, but I'm getting a recursive echo of everything we just said. Do you know how to?
I think you just have to mute yourself when I'm talking. Yeah. So yeah. So why don't you sort of sketch out what you see the problems are?
Well, okay, no, yeah, the echo has finally died down, so I think it's okay. The Oh, wait a minute. I'm uh, I'm sorry. It's still I'm hearing my own voice talking back to me.
Yeah, that's okay. And you got headphones on, right? Yeah, it's strange. Okay, it looks like you're muted.
I am muted. Mm. I'm still hearing you say everything twice.
Okay, that's very strange. Um, I don't hear any echoes or any feedback at all.
Hmm. Well, yeah, I'll just I'll turn off my headphones when I'm talking, and then that should be tolerable. S- so yeah, I can just talk for a couple minutes. And so I was going to say, uh, my assessment of where the culture's at is that we've sort of abdicated the idea of reproduction. Just haven't given it much thought. It's sort of the same way 100 years ago, everyone thought the wilderness could go on forever and we could keep finding new land and we could just throw things away. And eventually we started running out of wilderness and couldn't throw things away anymore. And I think the same thing has happened with human reproduction. We just figured, oh, it just takes care of itself. It's no big deal. We don't need to think about it. Um, and certainly, for the last several decades, I've just been every time I look at a graph of the population, and it's a hockey stick that just goes up and up and up. It's really scary. And so it seemed that overpopulation was the only thing to be worried about, and seemed to be laughable to think that underpopulation was something to consider. Um, but in lately, I've been noticing that throughout the industrialized world, not just in the West, but also in China, also in Japan, even Russia, they're not reproducing at a rate that replaces the existing population. And in in terms of using less resources, that's probably a good thing. But in terms of perpetuating the civilization, it does make one scratch one's head and wonder. For myself, I've got no kids. I got zero regrets about that. Um, and personally, I want nothing to do with kids. But when I think of the larger picture and think about how one whole half of my family tree has just gone extinct, several different people in the family on one whole side of my family just neglected to have kids, and and it started making me scratch my head and wonder: is there an underlying pattern to this? Does it mean something? What does it portend for the future and civilization as a whole? And it started making me thinking, well, what if we did the opposite? What if we had a civilization where human reproduction was the chief priority, and instead of something we brush off till later? What if we made a plan of how our society was going to do it ahead of time, and how would we incentivize reproduction to happen? Um,
Yeah. So what are some of the ideas that you've sort of been floating on for as a way to shift that focus and plan for reproduction?
so I started thinking back to my high school prom and thinking what a joke it was that I had a satisfactory time, but it seemed, looking back, seemed to be a huge waste of time and money and resources. And like, what was the whole point? It seemed to be some kind of celebration, but celebrating what? It's and I was thinking, well, if I were king of the world, abolishing proms would be the first thing I would do. But then I started thinking, well, what if what if it did commemorate something important? What if we could do something to make the high school prom the most important day of one's life? And then I started thinking, well, what if it were a giant mass marriage affair where all the high school kids got married all at once and having having kids and forming families all at the same time? That would be a real concerted effort to perpetuate the species, and it would be intensely meaningful.
Yeah. Well, one thing that is feeding into this lack of preparing for procreation is ultimately it takes a lot of money to procreate and a lot of energy and resources, and it's just not being allocated for whatever reason. For a lot of reasons, the society as a whole and individuals are just not allocating resources to that thing, and therefore it's not happening because it doesn't happen in a vacuum. Children are going to consume resources, and if you don't make provision for that, then it's not going to happen. And that's not, and we see that it's not happening. And so, and a lot of it is, individualism, right? People are living their own lives and they want to spend money on themselves. It's also related to, government, where the government places value. It values certain things that it didn't. So 100 years ago, governments generally were pronatal. They wanted their populations to have children, and in fact, 100 years ago, you still had to worry about infant mortality in a way that you just don't now in the first world. The governments now have opposite anti-natalist tendencies, ranging from China's draconian child population reduction strategies to less draconian but still anti-natalist policies of the West. Furthermore, there's a strong tendency in the West to educate women and send them to college. Well, when women's most fertile years are spent in school or career, then they're not having children, and by the time they hit the quote wall, they're really too old to be having children. And so there's all of these different pressures involved that are making this issue very serious.
Yeah, I was thinking that, if there's one primary value our culture seems to have, seems like maybe it's profit. That every society will have some kind of value that it values above all the other values, and the other values have to make room for it and bend around it. And with our profit-centered culture, of course, as an individual participates in the economy, it's going to be careerism that is the pinnacle of what people are striving for. And when careerism is the goal, there's no good time to start having children. It's going to interfere. It's going to be a burden. It's going to be extremely inconvenient. And I always think back to the opening scene in Idiocracy, the movie, um, where where it shows a contrast of poor family with the rich family, and the poor family are having lots of unplanned children because they put no thought into it, whereas the rich family keeps putting it off till later, till it's too late.
Yeah, exactly. So, as having pointed this out, then how would you envision your alternative take proactively taking this into account, allocating the resources necessary for child raising?
So my proposal is very pie in the sky. It's when I thought out of how it could actually work, it's something that could not happen within our lifetimes because the current divorce laws would totally undermine it. And so it would have to be something that would happen after society collapsed, after we went through a Mad Max kind of period, and then went through a barter town phase, and eventually started to rebuild a real civilization. Then at that point, we could reevaluate our priorities and figure out how to allocate the resources. So what I was imagining, just off the top of my head, is that a lot of economics is something that either postpones or prevents family formation. That families don't form during really rough economic times. Families don't form when the man is unemployed. Generally, I'm sure it happens once in a while, but as a general rule, people aren't getting married under those circumstances, and that marriages fall apart when the economics falls apart. That a chief cause of divorce is financial strife. And so I thought the name of the game, if reproduction were a priority, would be to remove the economic burdens from the marriage. And so I thought, if we want people to get married young, we have to, when you think of like an 18-year-old man who just became an adult yesterday, the one thing he doesn't have probably is wealth and property, and he's not going to have a house in which to have a bunch of children in. And so I thought, well, what if you give that young man a house, and then he could fulfill that role of being a provider. Um, and I would love to just forget that part of human instinct. It would be great if economics were not a primary concern of what causes marriages to happen or not happen. But if anyone in the comments could dissuade me of this, that would be great. But in my observations, it seems it really is a very strong factor that probably is baked into the human instincts at a genetic level, and that barring genetic engineering, we're never going to get rid of that. And so now that I've reconciled myself to the fact that we're probably not going to get rid of there being a material economic component to human mating. I'm like, well, how do we work with this instinct if we can't get rid of it? And I thought, well, the whole society gets together and decides to give an 18-year-old man a house in which to have the baby, and then the man gives the house to the wife in which to have the baby. And then there's nothing that would stop them from doing it right away.
Yeah, well, the whole economic issue is really the sort of elephant in the room that nobody really talks about when at the national level or cultural church levels this question is brought up, is the economics, because it's ultimately what's the number one driving factor for postponing, as it turns out, indefinitely, it would seem, family formation. And the question is, how clearly the economic situations are set up such that it's as difficult as is conceivably possible to have a family in the modern age, given the way the financial and economic structures are set up. But also, what people forget, and I chalk this partly up to a broad ignorance of history. Say 200 years ago, well, let me rephrase it. So today, if you look at a stay-at-home mom, all the responsibilities of raising the children are on her, which that's a lot. That's a big, especially depending if you have five, six, seven kids, that's a lot of work. Whereas 200 years ago, there was this large informal economy outside of the cash nexus where women were working with each other raising children. So aunts and grandmas who are older could be there to give advice and instruction to the mothers to help them raise the kids. Plus, they could, if mom had chores to do around the house, aunts or grandma could watch the kids. Younger women could be trained how to help the married women with children in order to prepare themselves for that task. Plus, there was a whole uh, group of women called wet nurses to help feed the baby. So there's this whole informal female economy outside of the cash nexus, usually within the concept of filial obligations. These are just things you did for the family because you were family. That's something that if you don't have, it becomes almost impossible to have children.
Sure, and yeah, it's especially uh, poignant now that we have that baby formula shortage. That it's only because of mass industrialism and really good distribution systems that run on diesel fuel that that baby formula was even possible as an option because the supply never got cut off, and now that the supply has got cut off, the wet nurses and other arrangements like that have become a matter of life and death uh, for today's infants. And yeah, I think the way the market is structured is really disadvantageous to raising kids, and that's why I thought a group that was either fully communal or semi-communal, like something like the Hutterites, um, could pool their resources, uh, give a house. You needn't be a fancy house, but just some kind of dwelling that keeps the rain out, to a young family, and then with and to seal that with a obligation that the young couple are obligated to pay that forward to the following generation, that they have to give up some of their largesse and provide a home to some other young couple when they're just starting their family.
Exactly, and also uh, the other built-in implicit deal was that the parents of said teenagers, when they were old, would then have built-in uh, care. So instead of having the government giving you Medicare or Medicaid, what you had was your children would take care of you when you got old. And so we're gonna, well, we have the resources now, we're gonna give you a house and a best start for your family so that when we get old, you can then pay it forward to us by taking care of us in our old age. And and you see all of these interconnecting obligations were historically evolved out of kinship ties and family obligations. And they were not these are not things that were inside the cash nexus. So of course you don't have to have money to do it, because of course all of these things now have, if you were to do them, you'd have to pay somebody, and most teenagers just don't have that kind of money, so they can't do it, and it doesn't get done. So what you'd have to do, but of course we're all hyper individualists, and it's like, well, we don't want to think in terms of future generations. We don't want to think in terms of taking care, being our quote unquote brother's keeper. And yet, because of that, all of this snowball effect is creating this problem.
Sure. I was also thinking forward to how would these people actually live, and I got some amount of hope from the co-housing model. How it's generally done in co-housing is they have row houses, um, where the houses are all next to each other, as either apartments or sometimes separate houses, but they're clustered pretty close together. Um, and these houses are not like a typical American dwelling. They'll either have no kitchen or just a really minimal kitchen. And the reason they can get by with no kitchen is they have a shared dining hall that the whole community comes together, um, and eats their food in the central building where these families aren't physically isolated the way they are in American suburbia. Um, and the kids can all interact. And there's a central courtyard. The houses surround the central courtyard where all the kids can meet and play safely without getting run over by cars. And it's a much more efficient and much more friendly neighborhood kind of vibe set up in the architecture itself.
So what you're saying then is that the living the living and sleeping arrangements are private, but like the eating is public in the
Yep.
shared space. Right. That would be a more convenient uh, model for raising children, because ultimately, if we telescope this problem out even further, we look at modern society, which is basically a slave to the industrial process, where man is constantly being shoved into this process of industrial production, which he doesn't fit because man is not a cog in the industrial process, and so that process and is what is the sort of like super dense, massive object over which everything orbits. And of course, children have, other than the next generation of workers, children have no place in that. That process isn't going to take into account and make provision for children. And so what ends up happening is it's the snake that eats its own tail, because it's you still need workers to replace the ones that die, so you still need children, but within the narrow focus of industrial production, that's just not something that they're ever going to consider and make provision for. But at the same time, if they don't, they run out of workers.
Yeah, I was thinking of it in terms of an analogy of analogizing it to a family is getting ready to move, and they've rented a big Ryder truck, and they're filling the Ryder truck full of all their important possessions. And when they're almost done, they're ready to pack the final thing, and the final object they need to pack in the Ryder truck is a grand piano. And they realize they've left no room for it. It's the most expensive and most difficult item, and they forgot to make room for it.
And so all of these sort of bigger issues are sort of the societal issues that this problem is embedded in, and these societal issues are impinging on this question and shaping it the way that it is. The other thing too, which is tied into the industrial process, tied into profit and career, is that not only have women identified themselves in contradistinction to mother and homemaker with career boss girl or self-actualized individual, but they've defined themselves against that. So it's not just that, well, that's one option amongst many that you could choose or not choose. They've defined themselves against it. And of course,
Yeah, like there's an antagonism.
yeah, like there's an antagonism. And so the problem now is, if we go back 200 years ago to the informal female economy that was working around, clothing children, feeding children, taking care of children, these are things that only women can do by virtue of their biology. So if women decide not to do it, it's just not going to get done. And that's one of the other things that we see.
Yeah, I'd say for the past 50 years or so, our society has done an experiment, and um, we've discovered, in case there were any doubters, that yes, indeed, women can do all the things that there's virtually no job a woman can't do. And so hooray, we discovered that. And certainly, at various times in my life, I've had a woman doctor, a woman lawyer, a woman dentist. It's the only world I've ever known and the only world I ever wish to know. Yet, we come up against the inconvenient truth, the problem that won't go away, which is that babies take a lot of time and a lot of attention and a lot of resources, um, and at a certain point, you can't do it all. Something's got to give, and we've tried to put band-aids over the situation in terms of having family leave. If we just have more generous family leave that's required by law, then things will work out, and that we can try to in addition to family leave, things like have more generous daycare available, and um, and there was a third thing I had in mind. I'm trying to remember. Um, well, I can't remember it right now, but going to extraordinary measures, to try to keep the careerism going while still having the babies, but it's always awkward and difficult, and there are just some hard biological realities that an exactly equal role in the reproductive process is probably impossible. And so, given that it's impossible, how are we going to work within the constraints of our human situation?
Right. Now, ultimately, I don't think any proactive measures will be followed, and it'll just anything that replaces this will just have to be after this system collapses. Because right now, we have the demographic issue where there just aren't enough people. Now, what we're going to see when the boomer generation finally dies, because the boomers, each subsequent generation is smaller than the boomers, and what you're going to see is overnight there'll be a massive shortage of everything, because it's like, oh, there's going to be way more jobs than there are people, because the current job market is for all of these generations. Once the boomers retire or die, then there won't be enough people for the jobs that are available. Now, part of this is what's driving the immigration crisis, but we also see these trends going on in Mexico, Middle East. So for how long will they be coming into Europe or the United States? Doubtful. And the other thing was, given what TFM and other MGTOWs have said, since women are going to continue to vote themselves the power that they currently have, there's no way within the system to change it. So his idea was just take your ball and go home, because it's going to collapse
Mhm.
sooner or later.
Yeah, I had an idea about that. Not to go off on a tangent about governance, but if we did have a society that valued reproduction as its highest goal, then it would make sense to only give the vote to grandparents. That and to give grandparents instead of our current system, which is works out to $1 one vote. We have a system that's one grandchild, one vote. And so you get proportional influence according to the number of grandchildren you have. And that way we are putting society in the hands of people who've already demonstrated they can not only produce the next generation, but also the generation following that generation. And those are the people most likely to know how to keep society perpetuated. What do you think?
Well, I think in most times and places, I would agree with you. I just don't think that. I don't think I trust the boomers with that kind of decision making power. Not today, but but yeah, the most societies would have had a sort of council of elders that, if they didn't have all the power, at least had a significant amount of power that people had to listen to. It's like, hey, okay, this is what the council of elders say. Better, better listen to what they have to say. And the one thing that I'll say though is, if we say that we give the political representation solely to these older generations, uh, it's easy to see that younger generations would be like, well, why are we going to buy into this? Because we're not going to be able to have representation or influence until at the end of our lives. And how do we know that the people ahead of us won't just, say, psych, we're not going to give you anything at all. You were taken for a
Mhm.
ride here.
Well,
So
the solution I had in mind for that situation was to, um trying to remember the way you phrased your question, which, well, what if the rug gets pulled out, you were saying, um and who wants to wait until they're a grandchild? Well, if people started having children at age 18, then they could conceivably start to be grandparents at age 36, and that's pretty young. Um, and so it's not a heck of a time to wait. Plus, if we changed our whole mindset from, and I think this is the linchpin that would um, make a human breeding program actually work, is if we switched from a system based on personal gratification of it just makes me feel good to get married, and switch that into a model based on self-sacrifice, that we venerate self-sacrifice, that we tell married couples with children, thank you for your service, um, and that we put all the honor onto the people who are deferring their personal gratification in order to make the personal sacrifices, and we put that as the pinnacle, that and we hold that up as like, these people are really awesome, they're the ones who are succeeding, they are the ones who deserve the most respect. If we did that, I think that would be enough for young people to choose it. Especially, you think, we use the same. People are willing to join the army and go halfway around the world to fight for a lost cause and get their legs blown off, and they come back with PTSD and end up as a homeless alcoholic selling pencils out of a wheelchair. And so people actually volunteer for that. If they're willing to volunteer for that, it's a much smaller ask to ask them to volunteer to start a loving family.
yeah, yeah, and what you said, it's a what needs to happen is a reorientation of goals and focuses. So rather than just my own personal interests without concern for the future, it needs to be, more broadly how we're all connected in this way and how we can lay a foundation for the future. One of the things that we've seen is a lot of people have been thinking, well, if we, in the long run, I'm dead. So it doesn't matter what I do now. I won't, all these other problems will be for other people to deal with. Well, that's assuming they don't happen on your watch. And a lot of people, beginning with COVID 2 years ago, uh, it's all started to come due, and it's coming due before they thought it was supposed to come due, and they're not ready for it.
Yeah, I think some we need a symbolism and a mythology that makes the new mindset make sense. And so I was thinking, um it seems a little silly, but why not have, if being fertile and having children is what we're going for, why not have a fertility god and a fertility goddess, and sort of hold them up as the symbol of what we, as role models for what we expect young people to aspire to. And um, you know, uh, it would seem obvious if we wanted people to just have a lot of kids. The quick and dirty approach would just be to have them convert to Roman Catholicism, because stereotypically Roman Catholics have a lot of kids, although that didn't happen in my Catholic family. Um, but then run up against the counterintuitive thing that that religion has a savior who never had any children, and then his mother is most famous for being a virgin, and those two aspects add up to not providing a role model that people can see themselves in terms of starting family.
Well, yeah. What's interesting here is if we look at throughout pagan religions with fertility cults, they often end up pursuing very infertile practices. So obviously, in ancient Canaan, having sacrificing your children is actually not conducive to fertility, uh, or the fact that a lot of these fertility cults, like in antiquity, also would would recommend what we might say today non-procreative sexual activities, which of course don't produce children. And then the question is also, how likely is it that people will go along with something that they know isn't true, something that they don't believe is true? Whereas, if some sort of repurposed Christianity, I mean, you mentioned Catholicism, but there are other denominations of Christianity that you could appeal to that wouldn't necessarily have the same problems. That seems to be a little bit of an easier of a sell, but yeah, we'll just
Yeah, certainly it would be less alien to our culture. And the only reason that I was even thinking of having some kind of central religion is to fill to put something in the void that would otherwise get filled up with something else, either worshiping a golden calf or worshiping diversity, inclusion, and equity, which our culture seems to be doing right now. Something will get venerated as the highest value unless you're really clear what the highest value is. And of course, like you said, in those ancient civilizations, there's a million ways to lose the plot and wind up doing the opposite of what you started out doing.
right. Yeah, no, that I would agree. There needs to be there's always going to be a religion-sized hole in people's lives, and you can't pretend that you can just leave that as a vacuum. Something will fill it. So, in the 90s, when we had the sort of decline of evangelical America, and the soul of America was empty, and that's when you had new atheism, the aughts. Well, it didn't stay that way. It ended up getting filled with the woke. The woke is what filled it. Um, and so that's where the religious right was correct. The idea that you can't just leave this as a vacuum, as a sort of steady state. No, something's going to fill it. And what ended up filling it is stuff that we don't. Many increasingly a great number of people are realizing, wow, we didn't sign up for this. But looking at go ahead.
Yeah, I think the reason it got filled with that is because it was what we already had to work with. It was what was already lying around, and what was already lying around was the notion, the story we tell ourselves about our civilization, that we went through this social evolution as Americans over the past 200 extra years of going from a civilization that was very discriminatory, and a lot of the discrimination seemed to be arbitrary and not justifiable. And then gradually we learned not to do that and fix the situation. And then we patted ourselves on the back of we learned to stop discriminating and be more inclusive and have more equitable treatment of people. And so that's what was already there. And so that became a civil religion where people started imagining that process had never happened. And so we continually relive it and pretend that we're starting from the most discriminatory place, and then chastise ourselves, and then turn that into some kind of uh, a something we self-flagellate about, and continually make it into a religious ritual instead of a process that we pretty much already succeeded at. And so, in contrast, what I would propose is that we start telling ourselves a new story about our actual civilization. That we have a conversation just similar to what you and I have talked about today, of where the civilization went wrong, how they stopped having babies, how we started venerating the economy as the highest good, and didn't make time for families, and neglected the youth, and they started to go crazy and started to start shooting up their schools, and committing suicide, and injecting fentanyl and all kinds of other social ills. And we tell the story of all these social ills and how we learned to stop doing that. I think that'll be the new story our civilization tells about itself.
Yeah, yeah. Because what I think also feeds into this is because of the worship of the economy for instant gain. One of the things that we see that has made interpersonal relationships very difficult to form, not just marriage, but since that's what we're talking about, marriage, is in order to maintain a relationship with somebody over time, it's going to take a lot of work, a lot of forethought, right? Because we live in this age of superabundance, nobody plans ahead. Everybody's like, oh well, you know what? If it doesn't work this time, there'll be more resources to just do it again. And so we constantly fall behind because nobody's actually planning ahead. And to avoid making mistakes, we just make the mistakes, and it's like, oh well, I guess we'll just clean that up mess up after we make the mess, rather than just not make the mess in the first place. And in order to maintain a relationship with your spouse, in order to raise children, you're going to have to put in a lot of time and effort, a lot of forethought. It's gonna be a challenge, and really nobody wants to do that.
Yeah, it's a huge burden. That's why I was thinking, you have a high school set up, and you spend the high school years teaching people how to have a family, and you have the classes led by people who are actually parents who have successful, intact marriages, and they tell you step by step how to do it, how to work out disagreements between the spouses, and tell you compassionate communication strategies. So you're not telling one another, well, the problem with you is, and you always do this, and you never do that, and just the bare basics of how to get along, and get along well enough to keep the family intact. And I thought in really extreme circumstances, you do have a possibility for divorce, but that unlike our society today, the divorce doesn't come with a bunch of goodies for one of the spouses. That it's going to be costly, costly for everyone involved, and that it's going to be undesirable. It would be great to have a real no fault divorce system where no one's at fault, but it turned out not to work out that way. That even under no fault divorce, people were still demonstrating fault in order to get a bigger payout in terms of the division of the marital assets. And so I think there's no way to have a fully win-win system. It's going to be it's going to hurt somebody some way. And so I think that the best solution is just to have divorce as a possibility, but have it be so arduous and difficult that most people will avoid doing it. And I was thinking, um, a system where the children, if the children are in a family that gets divorced, then the parents lose custody of their children, and the children have to be raised by another couple who are not divorced. And that would be such an intense penalty that most people would avoid divorce unless it were a life and death matter.
Yeah. Now, I guess circling back to your earlier example of the prom night, how are you going to allocate the human resources? Who gets allocated to whom?
Well, I kept thinking back to the high school system, that if it were structured similar to a high school, only instead of getting taught quadratic equations and dangling participles, if people were learning real practical stuff they would actually need in their real life, um, uh, that we could have, a class ranking, that some people do a lot better in school than others, and someone is going to be the valedictorian. And so society as a whole decides we're going to allocate the biggest house to the valedictorian, the valedictorian male. That way, the the females will compete to see which one can get in a relationship with the valedictorian. And the salutatorian gets a somewhat smaller house, and so on and so on down the ranking, and that the teenage boys are wearing uniforms where their class number, their class ranking is written right on their chest, and so that the girls don't have to guess of where that guy lies in the social hierarchy. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess that's one way. Now I want to say I remember you mentioning a lottery at one point. Uh, did I don't know
That
if
wasn't me.
that wasn't you. I must have been thinking of somebody else then. Right. And you mentioned with high school, it is amazing just how much of what's taught is just utterly useless. Like it's not useful for an adult life. Like going to high school in no way prepares you for what real life is going to be like. And this is just one of the ways, family formation, in which it doesn't do that.
Yeah, it's pretty sad. It seems the high school is pretty much good for nothing except preparation for college. And um, college used to be teach mostly nothing but how to be a binge drinker, and now it's become ideological indoctrination into a weirdo cult. And so, yeah, that whole system is sooner or later going to collapse, and after it does, we can rebuild from the rubble and try to rebuild something that's more humanistic and more geared towards people's actual needs in the real world.
One of the reasons why we uh, we have this problem is it's a scope issue because we think in terms of the economy, which is the national economy and then now the global economy. There's basically a scale which is just it's just too big for humans to realistically comprehend. Whereas marriage and child raising is a very small local scale issue, but because the economy is the way it is and our values are the way they are, they shift away everything from the regional and the local and the grounded to these abstractions that are global that you can't really relate to. I mean, you can talk about the global economy, but at the end of the day, when you're 80 years old, the global economy isn't going to give you a sponge bath. The grandkids you didn't have will.
Um, or well, there are people who save up their money and are able to buy long-term care insurance and actually get their sponge bath paid for in the global economy. So uh, yes, sometimes that can work in someone's favor, but a lot of the time people are falling through the cracks and wind up living in cold apartments eating dog food.
Yeah, and of course, with all that, we have this again, it's a scope problem because we're being pulled up to this global level, whereas the scale at which we live needs to be at a human scale, which is smaller and local. But there's no money in that, so the society that we live in doesn't really support it or encourage it.
Yeah, I had one idea for reducing the scope down to a human scale, which would be to bring the courtship of humans down to under Dunbar's number. And so I hadn't had the idea of you'll have one high school for boys, one high school for girls, and you have a class of say 100 boys. They do their courtship with another school that's like the girls' high school in the town next over, and so 100 of each come together in some kind of supervised courtship opportunity where over months and years they get to know one another, get to pick a mate, but they only have 100 as the number of potential suitors. That they don't have infinite choices and they don't have infinite time. And I think this is a happy medium between on we have our current culture system, which is just go out there and either make it happen or don't, sink or swim. If you end up living happily ever, fine. But if you end up living alone with cats, we don't care. It's none of our business. That's how our culture handles it. And in the past, we've had cultures have arranged marriages that are very constrained, and I think the people in arranged marriages don't have enough buy-in, because I was thinking back to a TEDx video I saw where a woman from a Hasidic community at some absurd young age, it might have been 14 or 16 or something, was almost basically forced into an arranged marriage where they had the husband to be come meet the young girl, and they only had 15 minutes to get to know one another before deciding whether or not that would be the husband. And just 15 minutes is not enough courtship and not enough range of choice. And so she ended up having a terrible abusive marriage that she ended up fleeing from. And the whole time, so much pressure was put on her in that 15 minutes to decide on that husband, that although it wasn't technically forced on her, it was so close to being forced that she didn't have any sense that she personally bought into it. And thus she was a lot less invested in the marriage that she would have been if she had a chance to choose her own husband, and have a range of other people she could have chosen from, and personally bought into it as a personal choice. And so I think constrained choice is the way to go. That we don't have infinite number of people to choose from. We don't have an infinite amount of time. You've got to make it happen. We don't have all day, but you do have a certain range of choice, although it's just constrained down to 100 people or less.
Yeah, a constrained choice is usually something that I would recommend as well. It's taking choice away completely is usually not a good idea. But we live in the sort of hypertrophy of choice, where there's just too many choices. And it turns out that when you're a donkey equidistant between two bales of hay, you don't go to either one. And so that's sort of where we're at now. We don't go to either one. And
Yeah, we even have a website called Plenty of Fish, with the whole idea of there's always more to choose from. If your relationship doesn't work out, you can always get another one infinitely for as many times as you want to repeat the process.
yeah, which it's just not true. Like you get involved in these emotional and sexual relationships with people, and then break up, and then do it again, and then break up. You think the society tells you that you can sort of start back at zero, but you never can. And so you have these accumulated traumas that lead to increasing dysfunctionality in the individual, because they're constantly exposing themselves to this based on a set of just false beliefs. We need to stop lying to each other.
Yeah, and then people are trying to start families at age 40 after they've accumulated decades of emotional baggage from failed relationships, and lost their youthful looks and lost their fertility, and our culture is saying, "Oh, that's a perfect time to settle down," and it's just madness.
It is madness. And well, one of the things that you've sort of assumed in these thought experiments is that really there needs to be broader community engagement. People need to just give a damn. They need to look at the people around them they're living with and be like, we are invested in you, and we are going to take proactive measures to plan ahead to help facilitate things. Because if you don't, you end up with this.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think that the message to the youth needs to be, "Hey, kids, we got your back. We are there to guide you and support you, and help you live out your dreams, as long as it loosely matches what society's dreams are for you. We can meet halfway, and have a mutual interaction where we're carrying forth the best things in our world into the following generation." So I was wondering, do you have an idea of what would it look like in your ideal world?
Well, one of the things that I've mentioned before is that I would envision a sort of intentional community where the sort of let's go back to the idea of having sort of informal female economy that doesn't exist anymore, but which used to exist primarily for, child rearing and feeding and all of that stuff. The problem right now is that we don't have individuals that are invested in the future or in each other because of the way we've set things up. And so using, what I broadly would say three rubrics, religion, philosophy, and what we might say, what used to be called kinship, is you sort of use all three of these as a means by which to reinforce a shared identity amongst this people. So, we start with the idea of kinship, where okay, we're all related, so it's an extension of filial obligations that we have to each other, that we do these things. And if you're not related, then it's not going to work, because that's filial obligations. These kinds of obligations structured this way only work if you are related, because it's sensible and realistic that you would look out for someone who you're related to in a way that you wouldn't look out for someone who you're not related to. And then the second one is, okay, well, we can't be completely parochial in this regard. So we have appeals to philosophy, and how philosophy teaches us to master our desires for the sake of the good. And in this case, the good is sort of having families and raising children is a part of the good. And so philosophy teaches us to, basically, if you want to look at like ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, the basic goal of all the different schools was how to master human desires, because we all have these desires that, if we don't limit or check, will lead to all these self-destructive behaviors. And mastering desire then is the key to happiness. And then these schools debated over how you did that. I would say that I'm particularly fond of Aristotle's philosophy, but the idea being that we have some sort of philosophical consensus amongst this community, where we're like, yeah, we're gonna have these values and then work towards them in this way. And then the religious would be, well, now we're spiritual brothers and sisters, as well. And with Christianity, the idea being then that we look out for each other in the way that Christ looks out for us. And so we have these like three overlays on an intentional community, where you reinforce community spirit, you reinforce, through education, through lived communities, through ritual, this sort of identity. And once you have this shared identity and this shared experience, it's kind of like what happens when you have guys in the army together. They learn to trust each other implicitly. They learn to rely on each other because they have to. And this way, we're sort of working along the grain rather than against the grain, because obviously it's gonna take a lot more energy to work against the grain than along it. And we're not going to be at the top of any sort of U.S. global empire, so they can afford to go against the grain for so long. And what you need to do then, as well, is what I would say is I would shift the education to being that for a woman, the best goal for her would be to be a mother with children, and that would be how the education is structured. So not just this is something good that you should do, but like actually teach her how to do it, right? Teach women how to participate in that economy again, because it doesn't exist now, and then recreate that as a minimum as an adjunct to this community, so that it has with the resources within itself to do this. That's a very bare bones account, but that's sort of where I'd start.
Yeah, no, it's great. Shared values, and then a filial system to keep people bonded together, and a way of understanding the microcosms part in the macrocosm of what the whole society is doing.
Right. Well, we're about at the end of the hour here, Nexus. Is there anything you want to leave us with before we wrap up?
Just think outside the box and question your assumptions.
Right. Okay. Well, we have one super chat from Ori Samsonov for 32 shekels. Nice tan, Todd. Well, thank you for the 32 shekels, Ori. This is thank you again, Nexus. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast signing off.